The morning I realized my neighborhood had declared war on me, I was standing barefoot in my backyard holding an empty watering can. At first, I honestly thought I was still half asleep, because sitting right on top of my wellhead was a steel enclosure that definitely hadn't been there the night before. Not next to it, not around it, directly over it. And hanging from the front latch was a bright yellow padlock that looked like it belonged on a construction site. I remember blinking a couple times, trying to make sense of what I was looking at while my old golden retriever, Duke, circled the thing with his nose pressed to the ground. Then I noticed a tag, a red plastic tag zip-tied to the lock. Property water source non-compliant. Do not tamper. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes when something is so ridiculous your brain refuses to process it, laughter is the only thing that comes out. I stood there for a full minute staring at that tag while the sun came up over the tree line, and somewhere in the back of my mind a thought started forming. I already knew who did it. See, by that point, I'd lived in Maple Creek Meadows for almost 18 years. Built my house myself, poured the foundation with my father, dug the well legally, passed every inspection, paid every tax bill, never asked the Homeowners Association for a dime, which, as it turned out, was exactly the problem. The woman who ran the HOA was named Vanessa Holt. Now Vanessa wasn't loud. The dangerous people rarely are. She had this polished smile that somehow made every conversation feel like a performance review. The kind of person who could insult you and make it sound like she was doing you a favor. About 8 months before all this happened, she became obsessed with what she called community modernization. That phrase was everywhere. Newsletters, meetings, emails, signs near the clubhouse. Community modernization. Community sustainability. Shared infrastructure. You know the language. Words that sound harmless until somebody starts using them to justify things they have no business controlling. The centerpiece of her plan was a new neighborhood water system. According to Vanessa, every homeowner should transition away from individual water sources and join a centralized network managed through HOA assessments. Most residents didn't think much about it. Some actually liked the idea. But my property sat outside the official utility expansion area. I had my own well, my own pump, my own water. And because of that, I wasn't interested. At one HOA meeting, I raised my hand and said, "My well is permitted through the county. Why would I pay for a system I don't use?" The room got quiet. Vanessa smiled. Not a friendly smile. A politician smile. Then she said, "Sometimes communities outgrow individual arrangements, Mr. Bennett." A few people chuckled nervously. I didn't, because something about the way she said it bothered me. Like my independence wasn't a practical issue. It was a personal offense. After that meeting, strange things started happening. First came the violation notices. My workshop paint color wasn't approved. My pickup truck was considered visually disruptive. One letter claimed Duke's barking negatively affected neighborhood tranquility. I wish I were making that up. At first, I tossed the notices in a drawer and ignored them. But they kept coming. Every week, there seemed to be a new complaint, a new fine, a new warning. Eventually, even my neighbors started noticing. One afternoon, my friend Carl from across the street walked over while I was replacing fence boards. He looked around to make sure nobody was listening. Then he said, "You know she's got it out for you, right?" I asked who. He gave me a look. "Come on, Ethan." That was the thing. Everybody knew. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Because Vanessa had spent years building influence inside the neighborhood. People didn't necessarily trust her, but they were afraid of becoming her next target. Standing there in my backyard staring at that lock on my well, I suddenly realized the harassment had crossed into something else entirely. This wasn't paperwork anymore. This wasn't petty HOA nonsense. Somebody had physically interfered with my property. So I went inside, grabbed my phone, and called the HOA office. The operations director answered on the second ring. His name was Kevin Rhodes. Smooth voice. Always sounded like he was reading from a script. "Maple Creek Community Services, this is Kevin." I didn't waste time. "Why is there a lock on my well?" There was a pause. Then I heard something that made my stomach tighten. He laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Then he said, "Mr. Bennett, all residents are expected to transition to the new community water system by the end of the month." I said, "You don't have authority over my well." His response came immediately. "Calm. confident, almost amused. If you intend to remain part of this community, cooperation is expected. Cooperation. Funny word. Sounds reasonable until somebody uses it like a threat. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. But the feeling stayed with me. The feeling that these people genuinely believed they had the right to decide who controlled the water beneath my land. And what happened the next morning would prove just how far they were willing to go. Because when I turned the handle on my kitchen faucet before sunrise, expecting the usual rush of cold well water, nothing came out. Not a drop. Just a hollow cough from somewhere deep inside the pipes. And standing there in the silence of that kitchen, I realized this wasn't about neighborhood rules anymore. This had become a fight over control. And the worst part was, I had a feeling I was only seeing the beginning. For about 12 straight hours, I was furious. Not the kind of angry where you yell at somebody. The kind that sits in your chest and keeps you awake. The kind that makes you replay conversations over and over until 3 in the morning. I kept picturing that lock. That stupid yellow padlock sitting on my property like somebody had planted a flag. By midnight, I'd already thought of 10 different ways to remove it. Boortkuiters, angle grinder, pickup truck, and a chain. But every time I imagined doing it, another thought kept pushing its way into my head. People don't usually do something this bold unless they think they're protected. And if they think they're protected, that usually means there's something they don't want examined too closely. That realization changed everything. Instead of going after the lock, I decided to go after the paperwork. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. Now, if you've never spent an entire day digging through permit filings, utility maps, and zoning documents, let me save you the suspense. It's unbelievably boring. Dusty cabinets, ancient printers, fluorescent lights that hum like they're plotting something. The whole place smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. But around lunchtime, I met a woman named Lorraine. She worked there forever. Nobody seemed to know exactly how long. The kind of employee who could find a document from 1997 faster than most people could find their car keys. I explained that I was looking into the new water infrastructure project connected to Maple Creek Meadows. The moment I said the neighborhood name, something changed in her expression. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. She leaned back in her chair, adjusted her glasses, then said that subdivision's been filing a lot of utility paperwork lately. I asked if that was unusual. She shrugged. Depends on who's filing it. That answer stuck with me. Over the next several hours, I started pulling every document connected to the project. Permit requests, contractor applications, engineering summaries, utility maps, environmental reviews, anything I could get my hands on. At first, nothing jumped out. It was just page after page of technical language. Then somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, I found the first crack. The project wasn't attached to any licensed municipal water authority. That seemed odd. A development-wide water network normally involved approvals from multiple agencies. Yet somehow this one appeared to exist in a strange gray area. I kept digging. Another hour passed, then another, and eventually the picture started coming together. Not all at once, piece by piece. Like a puzzle you wish you hadn't finished. The pipeline feeding the neighborhood wasn't connected to a traditional residential supply at all. According to the records, the source originated from an old agricultural irrigation corridor west of town, originally built decades earlier to support commercial landscaping operations. I stared at the map for a long time, certain I was misunderstanding something. But every document pointed to the same conclusion. The HOA wasn't distributing water through a properly licensed residential system. They were routing water through infrastructure never intended to serve hundreds of homes. I felt a chill run through me, because suddenly my locked well wasn't the most important part of the story anymore. Families were using that water. Kids were drinking it. People were bathing in it, trusting it. And as far as I could tell, most of them had no idea where it was actually coming from. I walked outside and sat in my truck for nearly 20 minutes before making my next call. My younger brother, Ryan. Ryan worked infrastructure maintenance in Colorado. Not exactly a water expert, but close enough. The second he answered, he said, "You sound terrible." I laughed. That's because my HOA might be operating a fake water company. Silence. Then he started laughing. Hard. The kind of laugh where somebody thinks you're joking. Until I explained everything. The lock, the shutoff, the permits, the pipeline. By the time I finished, he wasn't laughing anymore. Finally, he said, "Ethan, if that's real, don't confront them." I asked why. His answer came immediately. Because if they're willing to lock your well, they're already making bad decisions. Let investigators deal with it. So that's exactly what I did. I called the state compliance office. The woman who answered sounded exhausted, like she'd spent her entire day arguing with bureaucrats. But once I explained what I'd found, her tone changed. First, she started asking detailed questions. Did the HOA interfere with a permitted private well? Yes. Was the pump disconnected? Yes. Were residents currently receiving water through an HOA-controlled system? Yes. Could I provide documentation? Absolutely. I could practically hear her typing. Then came a pause. A long one. Finally, she said, "Mr. Bennett, what you're describing may involve unauthorized utility operation and possible property interference." Hearing somebody official say it out loud hit differently. Because up until that moment, a small part of me still wondered whether I was overreacting. Maybe I was just stubborn. Maybe this was a neighborhood dispute that had spiraled out of control. But hearing those words made something click. This wasn't normal. Not even close. The investigator told me not to touch anything. Not the lock. Not the well. Nothing. She wanted everything preserved exactly as it was. Then she thanked me for calling. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me nervous. Because now I knew somebody was taking this seriously. And serious investigations rarely end with simple explanations. The waiting that followed was brutal. Every day brought another letter from the HOA. More fines. More warnings. More demands. Kevin even left voicemails reminding me that my transition deadline was approaching. One message actually said, "Continued resistance may result in additional community enforcement actions." I saved every recording, every email, every notice. Meanwhile, the neighborhood atmosphere started changing. People acted differently around me. Some avoided eye contact. Others clearly blamed me for delaying the water rollout. Apparently, Vanessa had been telling residents that I was threatening expensive legal action against the community, which wasn't true. I hadn't filed anything. Yet, one afternoon, an older widow named Martha stopped by carrying 2 bottles of water. She looked uncomfortable, like she wasn't sure whether she should even be talking to me. After a minute, she lowered her voice and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." She glanced toward the street, then whispered, "Does your water smell strange?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The new water." She shifted nervously. "It smells different when it boils." That conversation bothered me far more than any HOA threat. Because suddenly this wasn't paperwork anymore. There were real people involved. People who trusted the system. People who assumed somebody had done their job. Over the next week, I heard similar comments from several neighbors. Cloudy water. Otosta. Pressure problems. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger panic. Just enough to make people uneasy. Then came the confrontation. The one I still remember perfectly. I pulled into my driveway one evening and found Vanessa standing near my mailbox. Kevin was beside her. So was another board member named Greg Palmer. Big guy. Belmanoscode. The unofficial enforcer of the HOA. Vanessa folded her arms as I got out of the truck. "Ethan," she said, "we need to discuss the disruption you're causing." I laughed. Actually laughed. "You're standing on the property of the guy whose well you locked." Kevin stepped forward holding a clipboard. "You've repeatedly refused compliance." I looked directly at him. Compliance with what? Neither of them answered immediately. So I did it for them. The irrigation pipeline. For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something crack. Just for a second. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Kevin glanced at her. Greg shifted his weight. Nobody spoke. And right there, in that brief moment of silence, I knew. They knew exactly what I had found. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every regulation. But they knew something wasn't right. Vanessa recovered first. People like her always do. She smiled. That same polished smile she'd used at every HOA meeting. Then she said, "You should be very careful about accusations you can't prove." And for the first time, I wasn't angry. I was curious. because beneath all that confidence, I thought I saw fear. Then she turned around, walked back toward her SUV, and drove away. The next morning, before sunrise, my phone rang. It was the state investigator, and the first thing she said made my pulse jump. "Mr. Bennett, I need you home on Tuesday." I asked why. There was a pause. Then she said, "Because we're coming to take a look for ourselves." And suddenly, after weeks of threats, pressure, and uncertainty, the waiting was finally over. The state vehicles rolled into Maple Creek Meadows just after 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. No sirens, no flashing lights, no dramatic entrance. Honestly, that was what made it feel so serious. People who know they have authority don't usually need to announce it. I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee when the first white utility truck turned onto our street. Then another one followed. Then another. Within 15 minutes, half the neighborhood was peeking through curtains or standing in driveways pretending they just happened to be outside. The atmosphere felt strange, like everybody sensed something important was happening, but nobody knew exactly what. The first HOA representative to appear was Kevin, and I swear I've never seen a man move that fast. 1 minute the clubhouse parking lot was empty. The next minute he was practically sprinting toward the inspectors with a folder tucked under his arm. Even from a distance I could tell he was nervous. His smile looked forced. His movements looked rushed. His confidence suddenly seemed a lot smaller than it had on those voicemail messages. A few minutes later, Vanessa arrived. And to her credit, she showed up exactly the way you'd expect. Perfect hair, perfect outfit, designer sunglasses. The same polished image she'd built her entire reputation around. She walked straight toward the inspectors and immediately started talking. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Temporary infrastructure, community improvements, resident benefits, emergency solutions, the usual language. The kind of language people use when they're trying to make something questionable sound responsible. The inspectors barely reacted. They just kept working, checking valves, reviewing documents, taking photographs, tracing pipe routes. Methodical, calm, professional. And the longer they worked, the quieter Vanessa became. Then something happened that changed the entire mood of the neighborhood. An elderly resident named Ruth stepped out of her house carrying a glass pitcher. She walked directly toward one of the inspectors. The water inside looked cloudy. Not brown, not dirty, just wrong. A few minutes later, another homeowner joined her. Then another. Then another. Suddenly, people who had stayed silent for months were speaking up. One family mentioned recurring stomach issues. Another complained about unusual odors. Someone else talked about pressure fluctuations that had damaged appliances. It was like a dam breaking. Once the first person spoke, everyone found their courage. And through all of it, the inspectors simply kept gathering information. Around noon, they found what they were looking for. The connection point. The source that tied everything together. Hidden behind decorative landscaping near the clubhouse. Covered by ornamental stone and shrubs. The kind of hiding place that probably seemed clever when somebody first thought of it. I watched one inspector call the others over. They crouched down, took photographs, compared documents, checked serial numbers, made notes. Nobody smiled. Nobody celebrated. But I could tell something had changed. A few minutes later, the lead investigator stood up and walked directly toward Vanessa. The entire street seemed to go quiet. Even the conversation stopped. I couldn't hear the beginning of what he said, but I heard the end. Unlicensed residential distribution. Then another sentence. Non-compliant source infrastructure. Vanessa started talking immediately. Fussed. Defensive. Trying to regain control. For years, she'd been the person with all the answers. The person who controlled the room. The person who decided what everyone believed. But something was different now. Nobody was listening. The lead investigator raised a hand and calmly interrupted her. Then he pointed toward my property, toward my well, toward the lock. I wasn't close enough to hear every word, but I heard enough. Permitted private well. Unauthorized interference. Evidence preserved. The color drained from Kevin's face. Greg looked like he wanted to disappear. And Vanessa, for the first time since I'd known her, looked genuinely frightened. Not angry, not offended, not irritated, afraid. About 30 minutes later, the order came down. The HOA water network was being shut down pending investigation. I actually heard the system die. A deep metallic vibration echoed through the underground lines. Then silence. Just silence. The kind that feels heavier than noise. Residents stood frozen in driveways, watching, waiting, trying to understand how the story they'd been told for months was suddenly falling apart. Then came the moment I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The lead investigator walked across my yard carrying a toolbox. When he reached the well, he looked up at me and said, "Mr. Bennett, we're authorized to remove the obstruction." That was it. No dramatic speech. No courtroom moment. Just a simple sentence. He knelt down, pulled out a wrench, loosened the hardware, and within seconds the lock that had caused weeks of chaos was sitting in the grass. I remember staring at it. This object that had represented so much frustration, so much arrogance, so many threats, and now it was nothing more than a piece of metal lying in the dirt. The investigator stepped aside. I walked over to the breaker, flipped the switch. For a second, nothing happened. Then I heard it, the low mechanical hum of the pump coming back to life beneath the ground. It might have been the most satisfying sound I've ever heard. A few seconds later, water burst from the hose beside the house. Cold, clear, steady, exactly the way it had for nearly 2 decades. Several neighbors actually clapped. A few laughed. Others looked embarrassed, like they were suddenly realizing how much trust they'd placed in the wrong people. The fallout came fast after that. Faster than anyone expected. The investigation expanded. Financial records were subpoenaed. Contractors started cooperating. Attorneys got involved. Residents filed claims. Insurance companies started asking uncomfortable questions. Within weeks, Kevin was gone. One evening, people noticed his office had been emptied after dark. By the following Monday, nobody could reach him. Greg resigned shortly afterward, citing personal reasons. Nobody believed that explanation. As for Vanessa, she fought longer than everyone else. That wasn't surprising. People who build their identities around authority rarely surrender it willingly. For months, she insisted she'd acted in the community's best interest, that she'd been trying to create a better future. That mistakes had been made, but intentions had been good. Maybe she even believed it. I honestly don't know. Eventually, the pressure became too much. She stepped down, sold her house, and moved away. The neighborhood survived. Barely. A new board took over. New policies. New oversight. Lots of promises about transparency and accountability. Some residents thanked me. Others quietly blamed me for the chaos. Property values dipped for a while. Friendships ended. Several families moved away. And every now and then, sitting on my porch at sunset, listening to the familiar hum of my well pump beneath the ground, I still think about that. Because the truth isn't as simple as people like to pretend. Yes, exposing the truth stopped something dangerous. But the truth also shattered a community that was already cracking beneath the surface. Maybe those cracks would have appeared eventually. Maybe I simply forced everyone to see them sooner. I still don't know. What I do know is this. Nobody has touched my well since. Nobody has questioned who owns it. And nobody in Maple Creek Meadows talks about community modernization anymore. Now here's what I'd really like to hear from you. If you discovered your HOA had crossed a line like this, would you have reported it immediately? Or would you have tried to handle it privately first? Did Ethan do the right thing by exposing everything, even knowing it would divide the neighborhood? Or should protecting a community sometimes matter more than exposing the people running it? Let me know what you think in the comments, because stories like this always seem simple until you're the one standing in the middle of them.